All right, here we are, finally. Last lecture of the semester. You guys are amazing for hanging in here. This has been a really rough semester for everybody, and good for you that you're hanging in. And the final quiz that I'll be giving to you this coming week is going to be fairly straightforward and fairly easy. So congratulations on making it through this semester. You're almost there, and it's going to be pretty easy and straightforward to get finished. So, yay! I hope everybody is planning on having a special holiday, if nothing else, just relaxing because you deserve it. This has been a rough semester for everybody. So, today we're going to talk about something kind of interesting and a little bit close to my heart. And I know that there are some folks in the class who are also interested in this topic, which is one of the reasons why I chose this particular module among the others that were available. Today we're going to talk about feminist care ethics, right? So I'm just going to dive right in. And if you're looking at the lecture outline, you'll see that I've done just a little a brief, very, very, very brief, extremely brief history of feminism. And the reason I say this is extremely brief is, feminism has been around. There have been feminist writers since the 17 and 1800s. Okay, so this is not necessarily contemporary phenomena. What is contemporary about feminism, though, is that it has become a much broader movement. Okay, it's actually started when people persist, changes are made. So right now we're inheriting a world that was fought for by a lot of women who went before us, and not just women, but men too. So there are men who are feminists. You don't have to be a woman to be a feminist. Feminism is not a gender-specific ideology. Like, it's not just women who can be feminists. Anybody can be a feminist, right? So we're living in a world where we've inherited a largely effective sort of how can I put it? We're enjoying the fruits of the labors that have gone before us for many, 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 many years, okay? So I am not going to go back all the way to the beginning and talk about feminist history because it would take a very long time. So I'm just dealing with here in my outline, I've just put some pieces that are relevant to the feminist ethics, contemporary feminist ethics that we're going to be looking at. So the one thing that I want to start with, and this is something that is really misunderstood, and I want to clear this up right away. There's a very simple way to define feminism, and the term itself has been thrown around to mean a lot of different things, and unfortunately has been thrown around to mean a lot of derogatory things. There is a certain segment of society that thinks that feminism is just about hating men, which I don't think that's the case. I think that feminism doesn't have anything to do with hating men. There might be some feminists who also dislike men for personal reasons, right? But that doesn't mean that feminism itself is a position, is a philosophy that requires disliking men. It really doesn't at all. In fact, men can be feminists, and that would be a little bit self-contradictory if it required hating oneself as a man. So I would like to take that off the table. If that's the kind of feminism that you've heard about, then you haven't heard about real academic philosophical feminism, okay? So there might be groups out there that promote that view of feminism, and they're wrong, right? So what we're studying an academic, philosophical version of feminism, which is the version of feminism that is responsible for the feminist movement. It was feminist philosophers and writers and academics, basically, right? The earliest feminists were writers, and they produced a lot of quality academic material. Whether or not they had academic positions in universities, in fact, most of them didn't because they weren't allowed to in the time when they were writing. But it has always been scholars who have set the tone for the feminist movement. And the fact that it is largely vilified and misunderstood in certain segments of society is not a reflection of feminism itself. It's a reflection of people's response to feminism. And a lot of times people have certain religious or social beliefs that run counter to feminist philosophy. And so they vilify feminism because it's easier to vilify a philosophical position and misconstrue it than it is to actually engage with it. right? So that's what we call in logic, we call that a straw man argument. And a straw man argument is just where you take a certain philosophical position and then you tweak it to make it look ridiculous as you possibly can, and then you attack that straw man. You say, well, feminism, this is an example of a straw man argument. Feminism is just all about hating men. What could be more ridiculous than that? The world needs men. Men are valuable to society, blah, 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 blah. Feminists don't disagree with that. So when you put up a straw man and you misconstrue, you intentionally or maybe sometimes unintentionally, just out of ignorance, misconstrue a certain philosophical position, and then you attack that misconstrual, you're not really actually addressing or engaging with that philosophical position. You're just brushing it aside out of ignorance or out of malice. It could be a number of different reasons why that happens. So I want to take the straw man feminism off the table. We're not talking about these caricatures of feminism that you hear on social media or in popular culture. We're talking about the academic discipline, and it's the academic discipline that has provided the philosophical oomph to the feminist movement. Okay, so we're just going to start out with what is just the basic definition of feminism, right? And it's this. It is a commitment to social, economic, and political equality of the genders. That's it. And that does not there's nothing in this definition that requires hatred of any other social group. Equality of the genders in social, economic, and political terms doesn't have to be violent. It doesn't have to be emotionally charged. It doesn't have to be something that involves negative attitudes toward others. In fact, most of us hope that it doesn't. Most of us would prefer that we can pursue a more just society for all genders without having conflict. That is what we prefer. Now, there are some feminists out there who also dislike men and who publicly say inflammatory things about men. That is true. But those are individual belief sets and preferences. And people can have multiple points of view. They can be a feminist and they can also have other beliefs that have nothing to do with being feminists, right? So they can be racist. There are some feminists who are racist. I mean, just because you're a feminist doesn't mean you're a quality human being, right? So you might hate men, you might dislike Black people, you might have all kinds of vices, and you might not be a very virtuous person. So being a feminist doesn't just automatically make you a virtuous person, just like being religious doesn't, or being a Democrat, or any of these other social identities that you can take on. There's no social identity that's going to make you a wonderful person, right? You have to develop virtue. You have to do the work to develop virtue, and you can't just rely on some philosophical position to give you credibility, right? It doesn't, okay? So all we're talking about when we're talking about feminism is just a commitment to social, economic, and political equality of the genders. Now, I'm not just saying women here. Feminism started out way back in the 1800s, at least this movement of feminism in the U.S. that's brought us to this point today with where we are socially. It was originally about providing equality for women. Back in the social context in which feminism first started arising in the United States, women were treated very, very differently than men, and we still are. In a lot of ways. It's different though. I mean, so it's changed over the years. The ways in which we're not equal has sort of shifted. But back in the 1800s, I mean, even in the 19th century, up through the 50s and 60s, like a woman's place in society was very different than a man's place. And so it was women who were like, look, I don't like not having social, economic, or political equality with my husband. I mean, women couldn't own property. They couldn't buy anything. I mean, even in the 1960s, women could not purchase homes or cars or have credit cards without a husband's signature. Women were not allowed to do those things. So that's not economic equality. That's economic dependence on a man, right? Social equality. Women were not allowed, all the way up through the 1960s, women were not allowed to pursue careers. And very, very few women did, and they were rare, very rare. If they pursued a career, they were allowed to be secretaries, nurses, or teachers. It was a very small range of options for women. And there were no, I mean, women, there actually were some women historically, like in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, who contributed significantly to our understanding of science and mathematics and even computational theory, right? I mean, before computational theory really became a thing in the in the first to the middle part of the last century. So women, there were really brilliant women who contributed a lot. Marie Curie, I mean, she wasn't here in the United States, but she was famous for her work with radiation, right? She was a famous chemist. And so there were women who were doing things. It's just that they couldn't hold academic positions. They could not be compensated for their labor, and they couldn't be recognized for their labor. Their husbands got a lot of the credit if they had husbands, or somebody would just take their work and take the credit for it. So there's a whole history of women who were brilliant, but who could not pursue careers in the areas in which they were fantastically gifted. Because there wasn't social equality. So as a woman, as anybody, like just think of yourself in that position. If there was just something about you that you couldn't change, that was just some feature you were born with, that required you to be a second-class citizen, to not allow you to pursue the things that you were good at or that you were interested in, to be recognized for your work or to be compensated fairly for your contributions to a particular field. I mean, that would be a difficult thing to live with, and women didn't like it. So feminism really started out as a movement among women who were tired of not having opportunities. They couldn't even vote. I mean, women didn't get the right to vote until 1920, and even then it was only white women. Black women did not universally they did not universally get the right to vote until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, I know that doesn't seem, it seems like a long time ago to some of you, right? So if I'm talking to some of you who were born in the 90s, you're like, well, I mean, 1965, that was forever ago. Well, it really kind of wasn't. I mean, that was only 8 years before I was born. I mean, that's not that long ago. So those of us who are a little bit older and who've been around on the planet a little bit longer, we recognize that this is a really recent history. This is recent U.S. history, okay? So Black women didn't get a right to vote until 45 years after white women did, right? So there was, even though some women were getting some rights, other women were not, and that's not a healthy feminism. A healthy feminism is one that pursues equal rights for all, and I'm going to get into why I'm saying all genders now instead of just all women. But at that time, there should have been more of a focus on all women. Okay, so and that's an example of, how women could still be racist feminists, and it's unfortunate, but humans are what they are, right? Okay, so women's suffrage. I've got all this in the outline, so you can kind of follow along. Now, okay, so why am I now calling feminism a movement to create, to secure economic, social, and political equality for all genders? Well, because we now recognize that gender is not a binary thing. There are some people who are non-binary. There are some people who don't identify as a gender. There are people who are transgender. And so we have people who don't fall on this binary sort of male, female. It's a little more complicated in today's landscape, right? So now that society has become a little more accepting of human diversity, just normal, natural human diversity, people are feeling a lot more confident about being who they are. And some of these people are transgender. Some of these people are non-binary, right? But if they do present with feminine characteristics, they're still treated. They're still treated like women. They're still treated. They don't have the same opportunities socially, politically, or economically, right? So there's still this sort of feminine presenting way, right? So some people who are non-binary might still have sort of a feminine presentation. They're still going to suffer from this sort of inequality, because it's tied to a feminine gender expression. It's not necessarily tied to being a woman these days. It's tied to a feminine gender expression. And a gender expression is just the way you present yourself, right? So clearly, I have a very feminine gender expression. I identify as female, and I express myself as female. And so given that there's this feminine appearance, my gender expression is feminine, I'm subject to these sort of sexist norms. But somebody who identifies as non-binary but still has some feminine characteristics may also be, subject to these sexist norms, right? So there's really, the issue is not with whether you're a man or a woman. The issue is with feminine gender expression, right? So trans women. So a transgender woman is somebody who was assigned the gender of male at birth, but then later came to realize that that's not what they are, and so they've transitioned. So transgender women who transition, once they transition to a more feminine gender expression, they are suddenly subject to these same sexist norms, right? They're limited in their opportunities, and unfortunately, transgender individuals have it even worse than just that, right? Because they're being deprived of just basic civil rights in a lot of ways. So feminism, contemporary feminism, actually takes on all of these issues because they're all interrelated. They're all interconnected. Race and gender interconnect. There are these intersections where people can be feminine in their gender expression and also be Black. And they're going to suffer from a certain set of conditions that are different than somebody who's feminine in their gender expression and who's white, right? So feminism really needs to address race issues. We need to address gender identity issues as they arise today, right? So feminism is now a much broader umbrella than it used to be way back in the early days. Now, feminism is largely concerned with just general social justice issues, right? So we're interested in human relations, and we're interested in structural features that prevent people from experiencing full rights as human beings, equal opportunities, right? So that doesn't mean that we are trying to take anything away from men. We're not. We're just trying to provide more opportunity for other people, and so there's nothing anti-men here at all, right? So in fact, here's something. Transgender men. Some transgender men. So that's a transgender man is somebody who was assigned the gender of female at birth and then later came to realize that that's not who they are. And so they have transitioned, and their gender expression and their gender identity is now masculine. But they can still become pregnant. So this is confusing. It's like, how do we treat these people? It's confusing for people. It's like, we don't know what to do with a pregnant man. And yet there are some out there. In fact, I follow somebody on Instagram who just gave birth, a man, a trans man who just gave birth to a child, a baby. And so how do we deal with this? Do these in some ways it's like, well, so society doesn't know what to do with them because we're so used to saying, oh, if you're a woman, you have all of these, characteristics, and then we're going to shove you into this corner. And if you're a man, then you have all these characteristics, and we're going to put you in this corner. So you obey those norms, and you obey those norms, and that's how society is going to run. But then when you come up with a man who can be pregnant, then you're like, I don't know what to do here, right? So feminism is interested in addressing these kinds of issues as well, right? What kinds of opportunities are still not accessible to someone who's a trans man because they have these sort of they have biological functions that people tend to associate with women, right? So it's getting a little bit more complicated. So contemporary feminism is a lot more complicated than it used to be, and it's much broader. Okay. Now, as I said, that the kind of feminism that I'm talking about is academic feminism, right? And academic feminism, the female scholars, and I follow a ton of them on social media because they're great people to follow. They're interesting. They're so incredibly intelligent, well-educated, and they think about these things. This is what they do for a living. They think about these kinds of things, like how should we restructure society in a way that provides equal opportunity for all kinds of people, not just women, right? So, and then people who are social justice, who are working in like issues of social justice, who are activists, then take those academic writings and they implement them into social justice strategies. So these movements, these social justice movements, these activist movements aren't just out there blowing smoke. They're relying on solid academic research, right? And so one of the things that these feminist academics have done is they've started to look at what are some of the shortcomings of our theories of ethics. Well, you might think that, let's just stop for a second and think about some of these principle-based theories that we've discussed, right? So we've discussed utilitarianism, some different kinds of utilitarianism. We've discussed Kantianism. These are this sort of a little collection of principle-based theories that we've looked at. There are variations on these, right? But these are general categories of our principle-based theories. Principle-based theories are going to look at specific actions and how to hold individuals accountable for specific individual actions. Okay. But if you look at some of the social issues that we have in contemporary society, we have a lot of structural oppression. What is structural oppression? Well, structural oppression is where you have institutions that are structured in such a way that they just automatically exclude people from equality. So the criminal justice system, there's a crap ton of structural oppression in the criminal justice system. You can look at the statistics, and the vast majority of the people who go through the system are persons of color, young men, a lot of young male persons of color, and specifically Black people, but it's not just Blacks. And if you look at the way the system is set up, you look at the policies, the way that this criminal justice system is actually set up, it is not intended. It's not like anybody intended for it to disadvantage young, poor Black men, but it does. I mean, just the way that we do our system of bail disadvantages young Black African Americans, as if they're African Americans that aren't Black, right? But young Black men, and there are so many different, I could go on and on. I'm just going to use that as an example, and I don't want to belabor the point. But when you have a system that is just set up in a way that just disadvantages people, when nobody intended to do it, right? Who do you hold accountable for that? And how do you bring a principle-based theory in and say, okay, somebody's going to be held accountable for this injustice, because that's what it is. If a system is set up to disadvantage some people and to advantage others, that's an injustice, which is a moral issue. So who are you going to hold accountable? How are you going to assess the moral culpability here? How are you going to assess the morality of a system rather than an individual? Principle-based theories don't do very well with this. Consequentialism probably does a little bit better. Consequentialist theories do a little bit better than deontological theories, but you still have some problems just from principle-based theories because they're individually focused. They're not equipped to really handle huge systemic issues. So we can have situations where people are behaving in a racist manner without ever intending to, just by following certain rules, because the rules themselves are inherently racist or sexist or whatever. So so you have to stop and think about, okay, if you're going to be dealing with these kinds of inequalities and these justice issues, you have to look at what kind of a moral theory is going to work better for assessing the actual moral value of our social landscape as we're starting to see that it is. And that's where feminist ethics comes in. So there are a lot of different theories that fall under the umbrella of feminist ethics, but they're going to have certain things in common. The first thing is that women's experiences are going to play a central role in theorizing. Okay, now I pulled that right out of the book. It's not the case that it's just women's experiences. It's the experiences of the disadvantaged. Now, historically, that we identified women as the disadvantaged, and that's how the movement got started. But now we recognize that there are tons of people out there who have certain kinds of disadvantages. Disabled people, Black people, gay people. You know, I mean, anybody you can think of who comes from a disadvantaged position, social position that's disadvantaged, this is going to apply to them too, right? So when we're talking about dealing with these kinds of structural justice issues, we want to center the experiences of the people that it's affecting. Why? Why is that important? We'll get there. Let me see. Yeah, okay. So when I get to the next section, we'll talk about that. But it's important to, I'm just going to say this much, that, that people who have never been Black don't know what it's like to be Black. People who've never been a woman, people who've never been gay. I mean, there are these unique perspectives. And the way that society treats you is going to be very, very different. The way your experience of society, your experience of social dynamics, your experience of political dynamics, it's all going to be very different for you if you're not socially privileged, right? So, and when I say social privilege, I just mean people that society is sort of set up to advantage. Rich white men. We can talk all about that, but rich white men are really sort of the people who are on the pinnacle of social privilege in the United States. And everybody else falls somewhere below that, right? It's not just rich white men, but it's rich, heterosexual, cisgendered white men. They're like the pinnacle of social privilege in the United States. Everybody else underneath that, oh, able-bodied, right? So let's do this. Let's do cisgendered, heterosexual, white, male, able-bodied, right? Disabled people are not socially advantaged. There are a lot of barriers to equality for people who are disabled. So you know, that's the kind of person who sort of has a much easier time in society than anybody who falls below that kind of standard. So it's important to take their perspective, to center their perspectives when we're talking about morality, because for feminists, morality consists in relations. Morality is not a feature of individuals, it's a feature of relations, right? So you need to know what the perspective is, how an individual is related to their social environment. That's a unique perspective. Black people are related to the social environment in the United States in a different way than women are, and in a different way than gay people are, right? So there are just distinctive things about being Black, about being a woman, about being gay, and on, about being disabled, that give you a perspective that's morally relevant, but that seems to be completely excluded by principle-based theories that are supposed to be just completely abstracted and impersonal. Okay, so feminist theorizing and morality is always going to sort of center the experiences of the disadvantaged. Number two, different biases. Now here it says gender bias is not ignored. Well, we don't just ignore gender bias, but we also don't ignore racial bias or homophobia or transphobia or xenophobia, right? Any of the other things. I'm just reminded that even being Muslim in the United States is a disadvantage. It's unfortunate. So let's see. White, Christian, heterosexual, cisgendered, rich, Able-bodied men. Yeah. Anyway, we could just go on and keep listing them. This is not alcohol, by the way. It's just tea. I'm saving my alcohol for a very, very late happy hour later tonight. Okay, so we're not going to ignore biases. That's something that's going to play a role in theorizing. We're going to have to look very realistically at, if we're looking at social dynamics, we have to realize that people have biases. And how do those biases manifest in social relations? Yeah, so good. So some feminists have argued that some of the more abstract, impersonal, principle-based moral theories presuppose a masculine social experience. So if you look at the people who actually developed these theories, they are generally wealthy, white, heterosexual, cisgendered men. And when you sit down and you contemplate and you think about morality from your white, male, privileged perspective, you're going to come up with something that might not be adequate in the application for a person who doesn't fit that sort of profile. There's a whole lot of presupposition. There's a whole lot of assumptions that have gone into producing those moral theories. And they largely ignore any sort of experience that lies beyond that, right? Now, that sort of standpoint might be why these principle-based theories are kind of incomplete in a lot of ways, because they don't have a broad enough perspective, right? They're not in tune enough to relevant moral features of a situation or even moral properties in the world. That's what some feminists argue. Okay, moral reform. So here's the third thing that feminist ethics all these feminist theories are going to have in common. Moral reform is a primary aim of feminist theorizing. Feminists are going to recognize that the world is broken in some really interesting ways and some really damaging ways. We have a social order that is unjust. It is thoroughly unjust. And if we want to fix that, presumably we want to live in a better world, right? So we need to engage in theorizing that's going to lead to moral reform. And so that's always going to be a focus. Feminist theorizing is always about reform in some way, social reform. Okay. Good. So, next section. Let's see. Okay, good. So now we're going to talk a little bit about what are some of the criticisms that feminists have leveled against principle-based theories. Well, one of them is a criticism that we've already encountered when we looked at virtue ethics in Module 11. So feminist ethics has a lot of similarities to virtue ethics. Now we'll see how it's fundamentally different, but it has some similarities. And one of the similarities is this, that feminists don't think, just like virtue ethicists don't think, that principle-based theories provide a very good view of human nature. They have sort of a distorted view of human nature, right? So you might think that if you so let's put it this way. Okay, so you might think that morality is just a natural part of human society, right? That's something that we evolved to participate in. We evolved, we're a social species, and so we evolved these sort of moral sensibilities. And if it's just a natural part of human society, then being a moral person shouldn't require you to become something unrecognizable to your fellow human beings. You should still be able to just be yourself, right? So, but think about the utilitarianism. If you're going to be a very moral person under a utilitarian sort of worldview, how are you going to be? Well, you're going to be donating your organs. You're going to be donating all your income. I mean, you're going to be doing as much good as you can for the greatest number of people, even if that requires you to undergo tremendous self-sacrifice constantly. So, but it looks like that can lead to some state of being that is not healthy for an individual. That can lead to a situation where somebody's social relations are strained, right? So you might look at that and go, that's just not normal. That's not normal. That's just not consistent with how human beings are. We could be moral without having to become something inhuman, right? That just seems weird. If you look at Kantianism, it's this sort of this same thing. Like, how many of us would have the moral aptitude to protect Jewish people during a Holocaust, to try to hide them and protect them from being killed by the Nazis? How many of us who have the kind of moral sensibility to do that would then turn around and tell Nazis that you're hiding the Jews because you can't lie to the Nazis? Nobody would do that. If you have the moral sensibility to start the project, you're going to have the moral sensibility to finish the project and to put human life above this need to always tell the truth, right? So you might think that, Kantianism is interesting, but it doesn't quite capture actual human behavior and human social dynamics and social relations. And also, Kant had some ideas that we didn't really talk about, but his idea is that humans are just these rational calculating machines. And it's just like, well, no. And I can see why Kant thought that. Kant was actually autistic. He had Asperger's syndrome. He was on the spectrum. So emotions, social dynamics, interpersonal relations, those were not things that concerned him. He was not interested in any of that. In fact, you hear stories about Kant from his neighbors, and he was in the 1700s. But there are these stories still that have survived with his work about, people who told stories about him. He would go for a walk at the same exact time every day. He was methodical. He was rigid. He was a rational calculating machine, but he was also autistic. Now, is autism abnormal? It is part of human diversity, but it is only one slice of human diversity. So Kant wasn't necessarily wrong, but he was approaching morality from a very limited perspective. He was approaching morality from the perspective of somebody who has Asperger's, right? And so his moral theory might make the most sense to somebody who's very much like him, who has the same neuro sort of framework. And that's okay. But to say that encompasses, that's sufficient to cover all of human morality, it doesn't seem right. It just doesn't seem right. Okay? So it just doesn't capture a broad enough picture of what human beings are really like. Yes, some of us are autistic. Some of us are disabled. Some of us are women, some of us are men, some of us are black, whatever, right? So the moral theory has to give us a much more realistic picture of human beings in general. So, good. So that's a criticism that feminists are going to level against principle-based theories. It's like, you guys, you're moral people. You're the people who you are going to hold up as these moral beings look weird, like really weird. And that just seems weird. Everything's weird. Weird is such a good word. That's a technical term, weird. Actually, it's not, but strange is. If you ever studied quantum physics, or particle physics, you'll know that strange is actually it's the name of a quark. There's a strange quark. Okay. So it is a technical term, but weird, not so much. All right, so here's another issue that feminists have raised for principle-based theories, and that's this: that principle-based theories are impersonal, impersonal, which means that especially if you're a utilitarian, if you're a utilitarian, you have to have, suppose that you are on a boat that's sinking and you can save one other person. You can save yourself and one other person. And there are two people. You can, and one of them is a stranger and the other one is your spouse. Utilitarianism says it's arbitrary. Your choice between them is completely arbitrary. If you don't have the means to know, you can only save one life, but you don't know anything about the stranger. You know a little bit about your spouse, but if you can't calculate that one is going to produce greater good than the other, then your choice is really arbitrary. You're morally correct to choose either one. And that just seems weird to us because most of us are just automatically going to choose our spouse. We're just going to do that. And we're going to feel justified in doing that. Well, feminists are going to say, yeah, sometimes you are justified in choosing your friends, your family, your loved ones. You're justified in acting on their behalf and choosing them. And it's not an arbitrary choice. It's a moral choice. It is the morally correct choice to choose them over strangers. Sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. Right? So you don't have any justification for doing that if you're a utilitarian, unless you know for a fact that saving your wife or your husband is going to produce the greatest amount of good, or greater amount of good than saving the stranger. But you don't know that, right? So if you don't know, then your choice is arbitrary. You don't have any justification for it, but you have to do one. So it's an arbitrary choice. You might as well just go eeny, meeny, miny, mo, right? A feminist is going to go, absolutely not. The morally correct choice is to choose your spouse. Right? Under a lot of different conditions. Under some conditions, it's not. But there are these special moral obligations that we have to the people that we are in intimate relationships with. Because for a feminist, that relationship is the basis of a moral, is the fundamental moral thing, right? It's not just, am I a moral individual for, making this calculation and choosing the right course of action? It's my relationship with my spouse is the fundamental entity that morality is concerned with. It's not necessarily concerned with my actions as an individual. It's concerned with my dynamic in the relationship with my spouse. So if I don't choose my spouse, I'm ignoring the moral reasons that I have to save my spouse. Okay, so that seems really intuitive, doesn't it? I mean, most of us are going to think that way anyway. So, there is a difference between what humans naturally do and whether or not we should do those things. But as I said, if you think that morality is just a natural thing that evolved in human society, and I think that it is, I think that there's plenty of evidence for that, then it makes sense that we're going to find certain things just intuitively better than others, morally speaking. And this just seems to me like it just seems intuitive that we do have some special obligations to people who are closest to us. Now, if you're a utilitarian or a consequentialist, you can justify that by saying, well, in virtue of our relationship. Now, remember, for a utilitarian, it's still you're doing calculations. It's not about the relationship, but because you are in a relationship with a person who depends on you, their well-being should matter more in your calculations than the stranger, because their well-being is tied to your actions more intimately than that of the stranger, right? So you're going to cause them greater harm by letting them drown, in some sense. Like, you might be able to make this argument. I'm not saying this is a good argument, but I'm saying if you're a consequentialist, you might be able to sort of give a justification, but it's still not going to have anything to do with the relationship itself. It's going to have to do with the fact of harm, right? That because the relationship is there and there's no relationship with the stranger, you're letting them drown suffer is going to cause them greater suffering than it would if you let the stranger drown. Okay. So you might be able to sort of accommodate the special obligations from a consequentialist perspective, but you're still looking at it from a different perspective. You're not looking at it as that morality is grounded in the relationship and not just the individual actions. Okay. Here's another way in which feminist theorizing is different from principle-based theories, is that there's a role for emotion. Now, principle-based theories treat emotion as irrelevant. Your emotions are completely irrelevant to morality. They're morally irrelevant. If you're making a moral decision, you should be as cold and calculating as you can be. It's all rational. It's just completely reason, no emotion, nothing like that. Get rid of it. It's inconvenient. Well, a virtue theorist, okay, recalling module 11, a virtue theorist is going to say, oh, no. Emotions are really important to developing virtue because our emotions are part of who we are. And our virtues are going to manifest with emotion. Courage. There are emotional states that are associated with courage. There are emotional states that are associated with being empathetic or kind or any of these kinds of things that we would consider virtue. That's a whole sort of holistic state that involves emotions. So it's not that we should cut our emotions out. We should learn how to train our emotions to enable us to be as virtuous as possible. So our emotions are an important component of virtue, according to the virtue ethicist. Now, this is where feminism is very much like virtue ethics. Feminists are like, oh no, emotions matter. Emotions absolutely matter in the same way that they would matter for a virtue ethicist. And also because our relationship dynamics are very emotionally engaged. Without emotions in a relationship, it would be sterile. There would be something seriously lacking. Now, whether or not you think love is an emotion, there are a lot of people who don't. I'm one of those people who doesn't think love is itself an emotion, that it does, however, have a very robust emotional profile. But if you're in a loving relationship, you want to have healthy emotional dynamic there. That's part of what makes relationships wonderful, right? That's part of where the pleasure of a relationship comes in. That's part of where, when if your spouse is struggling and you engage in empathetic or compassionate response, that's going to affect that dynamic, right? So emotions are a really important part of any relationship, whether it's a really personal relationship or whether it's even just a social relationship, right? So just passing social relationships, you kind of have to be cooperative and trusting of just even strangers. We trust every day. We trust strangers every day. When we walk down the street, we're trusting that they're not just going to jump out of their cars and kill us, right? Our default position with people, for the most part, unless there's something broken in your brain, like if you have PTSD and you're afraid, full disclosure, I actually do have PTSD. So if anybody is watching and they do have PTSD, I am not crapping on people with PTSD. It really is like, you'll know as well as I do that it is like having a broken brain. There's a part of your brain that's just broken, right? So sometimes you just can't function. So if you have PTSD, I am not crapping on you at all. I'm just speaking from experience, right? So there's a broken part of your brain and it will always be broken and you just do the best you can. But the point being that unless you have some condition like that, usually most of us, our default position toward other people is positive. We don't just expect the person walking their dog in the park or the jogger running by to do violence to us. So there's a certain amount of that's a social relationship. It can be temporary. It can be, not super close, but it is a kind of relationship. And there is a certain moral dynamic in that relationship as well. And we just pretty much trust one another to not have malice. And unfortunately, this is why in the 1970s, a lot of serial killers were so prolific, is because people were even more trusting back then. I mean, we've gotten less trusting as as the world has progressed, but there's still a certain amount of social trust that we extend, and we generally do tend to have a positive attitude toward strangers. So emotions are important in all kinds of social engagements, right? Okay. Finally, principle-based theories treat moral agents as self-sufficient, self-made individuals. And feminists claim that this is really a myth that's perpetuated by the fact that men have largely ignored the role of unpaid labor, the unpaid labor of women in their own successes. So Fortune 500 CEOs are a perfect example. I mean, think about all of the education and experience that you have to eventually end up as a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. You're going to have to have a lot going for you. You're going to have been able to have the right connections or whatever, but there's a lot of work that goes into getting into that kind of a position. And currently, in this wonderful world that we live in, that's so equal opportunity for everyone, there are only 7.5% of Fortune 500 companies have female CEOs. Why is that? Well, part of it is because women, even though we've gone into the workplace and we've pursued careers and we've pursued education, we are still also expected to do all of the domestic labor. House cleaning, child rearing, cooking, grocery shopping, all of that. It is still the case that most of that is done by women, even professional women. This is a serious problem in academia because women who have children or who are married tend to not be able to progress as quickly in their careers and to make full professor as quickly as most men because they don't have a spouse who's doing it all for them. Men still take it for granted that they have a wife at home who's doing all that stuff for them, or else if they're financially secure enough to pay somebody to do it. But for the most part, it's women, who are doing it in addition to their own work. So it may look like this man is just out there being a star, right? Well, in actuality, he's getting a lot of free emotional labor from his spouse, childcare, clean clothes, food, right? So there is somebody who's doing all of this for them. That's not a self-made person. That's somebody who has a lot of free domestic labor. And that's, so this whole I'm a self-made individual, it's like people saying that, Kylie, one of the Kardashians or the Jenners, was a self-made billionaire. I'm like, do these people understand what self-made means? Inheriting millions and millions of dollars does not make you self-made. That makes you a trust fund baby. That means that you got a leg up above everybody else in society, because how many of us are going to just inherit millions and millions of dollars? I didn't. You probably didn't either. You're saving money at community college, right? So it is highly unlikely that any of us inherited millions of dollars. That's not self-made, right? And in the same way, men get a lot of free shit. They just do. They get a lot of free labor from women, right? So that self-made, self-sufficient stuff is just BS, according to feminists, and I agree with it. Okay, so feminist ethics, contrary to the emphasis on the individual and the independent, self-governing individual of these other principle-based theories, feminist ethics is going to emphasize the interdependence and connectedness of people, right? So it's grounded in relationships. Again, feminist morality is always going to be grounded in relationships. All right. So this also means you can't be a moral person unless you're in relationships, some sort of social relations. So is a person who's living out in, so here's an example, is a person who's living out in, some hermit who's living out in the woods by themselves, living off the land, completely detached from society. Can that person be a moral person, according to some sort of feminist theorizing? Well, yes. Because feminists also recognize that we have a relationship with nature and we have a relationship with other sentient beings. So you can have a relationship with animals. You can have a relationship with nature, right? Environmental ethics is a big deal in feminist theorizing. Climate change, all these kinds of things. So you can be in a particular moral relationship with nature. So you have to make an argument for how that is distinct from the kind of moral relation that we typically have with another human being. But it's possible to do that. So just because somebody lives out in the woods doesn't mean that they're necessarily devoid of the capacity to be moral. You don't have to be with other people. All right. Now let's talk about the ethics of care. Let's talk about caring. Caring is a central feature of many feminist theories. At least it's going to be a central theory of all care theories, obviously. And the book doesn't get into what caring actually is. It's just relying on this sort of intuitive notion of what caring is. So I go into a little bit more detail in my outline because I think it's important. This detail is important to help kind of explain some of the stuff that's in the book. Okay, so there are a number of different theories about what caring involves, but there's one that I really like. There's a philosopher by the name of Harry Frankfurt. He's a professor emeritus at Princeton. He's written a lot of amazing stuff. I really am a big fan of Harry Frankfurt's. In fact, one of the things that he's written that's actually quite popular, you might have heard of it, is an essay called On Bullshit. That was making the rounds on social media after the 2016 election, because Trump is he is the quintessential bullshitter. But anyway, so Harry Frankfurt really has this wonderful way of just seeing people, right? So his philosophical work is very much engaged with what human beings are really like, and I really like that. And so he has this idea about what caring is, and he says that caring involves wanting another person's well-being. Well, what does that mean? Well, what contributes to your well-being? There are just some basic things that contribute to human well-being. Having your basic needs met, not being harmed. Having positive things in your life, having desire, satisfaction, having pleasure, these various things, these human goods, you might think that meaningfulness in life. If you care about somebody, you want them to have those things. You want them to have pleasure. You want their desires to be satisfied. You want them to have successes. You want them to have their needs satisfied. You want them to be loved, right? So if you care about somebody, then you desire their positive well-being. They're sufficiently high level of well-being for them. And that's a pretty simple definition of caring. What's interesting about it, though, is that desires are motivational states. So they're mental states, like beliefs are mental states, right? They're states of mind. So when you desire something, a desire is just essentially a motivational state. It's just the kind of mental state that is motivational. So if I desire ice cream, I'm going to be motivated to try to get some ice cream, unless I have some overriding desire. So suppose that I also desire to stay fit, and ice cream is going to blow that out of the water. So I might desire ice cream, but if I desire to be fit and that is an overriding desire, then I won't pursue my desire for ice cream. But it might still be there. And in times when I'm feeling a little bit weak, it might be an overriding desire and it might motivate me to full action, right? I walk by Jenny's and I see there's no line, wide open. Oh my God, I'm walking right in. I'm going in and I'm getting Jenny's ice cream. So good. So good. Okay, so when we desire another person's well-being, we are motivated to promote and to protect that person's well-being. Which means we have to pay attention to what their well-being consists in. We have to pay attention to what kinds of things are going to be good for them and what kinds of things are going to be bad for them. So you really have to pay attention to individuals. I mean, there are just some general things that are going to, benefit everybody. Desire, satisfaction, pleasure, meaningfulness in life. But that's just generally. When you're in a relationship with somebody and it's your job to protect, if you care about them and you want to protect and promote their well-being, then you have to really pay attention to what is good for them and what's bad for them. And you have to be engaged, right? And that is the domain of morality, according to the feminist care ethics. Okay, so there are different kinds of relationship that are going to ground to different kinds of moral behavior. And relationships can be either asymmetrical or symmetrical, okay? I'm not going to get into detail about what all the different kinds of relationships are. But here are just some important differences. Like there can be some very nuanced views under the umbrella of care ethics. So just start with a basic distinction between symmetrical and asymmetrical caring relationships. A symmetrical caring relationship is something like a spouse, right? You're in a romantic partnership with somebody, and both of you care about each other. And you take it as your responsibility as a partner, as a properly moral partner to promote and protect your partner's well-being. You do it for them, they do it for you, right? And you can also be in a moral relationship with yourself, right? So you can protect and promote your own well-being. And sometimes it's important to put your own well-being above others. Not always, clearly not always, but sometimes that's okay. Self-care is okay. So, so that a symmetrical relationship is one where you both parties of the relationship are caring for each other. An asymmetrical relationship is going to be one where you've got one person who's the carer and the other person who's the cared for. Now, a parent-child relationship is an asymmetrical relationship for the very early years, right? So as children get older and they start to, be aware of the world around them, and they start to learn many things, and they start to become very attached to and care about their parents. But when they're very, very young, especially infants, there's a very asymmetrical relationship, right? Parents are doing a lot of, it's self-sacrificing. A lot of people say parenting is self-sacrificing. Well, yeah, because a lot of times you're in an asymmetrical caring relationship. You're the carer and they're the cared for. But we can move beyond the family to find both symmetrical and asymmetrical relations. So a nurse caring for a patient, that's an asymmetrical caring relationship. Just structurally speaking. Now, some people can become very attached to their nurses and they can care about them too, right? So that happens. But just strictly speaking, the profession of nursing involves many asymmetrical caring relationships. Teaching, same kind of thing. So you can look around in society and you can see that when you're playing certain social roles like teacher or caregiver, a nurse or a doctor or what other kind of politicians are supposed to be caring for the well-being of their constituents. So there are a lot of these social roles. Almost any social role that you occupy is going to involve some form of at least asymmetrical care, where you have to care for other people. Whether if you're oh my God, I'm sorry if this is you, but if you're a customer service representative, you have to care for the customer. Right? It's asymmetrical. Now that one is an obviously asymmetrical relationship. I mean, if you've ever done customer service, I haven't, but I have called customer service many times, and there have been times when I have been a little bit ticked off. I try not to abuse people who do customer service because I know they get that a lot, but there have been times where I've just been a little bit less than pleasant with customer service representatives, and there have been very few times when they have been unpleasant with me. It's mostly an asymmetrical caring relationship where they're caring for me. Unfortunately, I do better now than I used to. I do a lot better now than I used to. Now I'm like chit-chatting and making friends with customer service agents because I feel for them. I really do. Okay, so these are two kinds of relationships that kind of pop up all over the place. You might also be in an unrequited love sort of situation. So maybe you really love somebody but they don't love you back, and you can't stop loving them, but they're not going to reciprocate. But you decide you're going to love them anyway. So you're concerned with you try to protect and promote their well-being whenever you can, and they don't reciprocate. That's an asymmetrical caring relationship, right? And there's a certain moral dynamic that happens there. Okay, let's see. So the role that one plays in a relationship, whether you're the carer or the cared for, whether it's symmetrical or asymmetrical, is going to determine what moral responsibilities you have. So your moral responsibilities are going to be different with respect to children than they are to your spouse, or with regard to patients or your boss or whatever. Now, there's not a lot of detail in the book about what those moral responsibilities are and how they arise out of these caring relations. So you might think, well, look, what matters is protecting and promoting the well-being of the other person. And so the moral constraints in this relationship are going to be something consequentialist. So maybe my moral responsibility arises, right? So my moral responsibility is grounded in the relationship itself, right? So that's different than a traditional consequentialist theory. But given that there is that relationship, then it might be the case that the morally correct thing to do is whatever is going to protect and promote the well-being of this individual, right? So that's an individual thing. It's particular. It's not universal. It's particular. The morally correct thing to do is it might be have a consequentialist kind of flavor to it, but it's specific to an individual and to the context of a specific relationship. Okay, so that's one way to think of it. And I think that's a fairly common way to think of it. Okay, so there are a couple of other things here, definitions that are relevant to understanding some of these theories, which they don't really get into too much detail. So mutuality, whatever, you could read it. That just means being tied together to another person through a relationship, right? And this involves shared feelings, values, knowledge, experiences. Okay. This is interesting. Transformation. Now, I think there's something really about, I think this is really an interesting feature of, I think there's a lot to be said for feminist ethics. I really do. I think that it's important. I like the fact that it's grounded in relationships. I have a tendency to be sort of I'm a consequentialist, but I have a lot of virtue leanings. And so I think feminist theories tend to sort of meet my standards for morality. But this is something about it that I really like. So the best place for humans to undergo a personal transformation is in the context of relationships, right? So when you think about the things that change you the most, they're not usually like, external events that are just sort of random. They're people that influence you. They're things that people do. Other people are the ones that shape us. Now, thousands of years ago when we were living off the earth, maybe that wasn't the case. Maybe we were more shaped by our environment, by, the weather or the animal migrations. Those things might have been greater shaping forces in our lives. But today, social shaping forces are the evolutionary drivers of human evolution today, right? So what's shaping us and what's changing us and what's causing us to evolve, and we're still evolving, what's causing us to evolve is relationships. Right? So transformation happens in response to what other people do. So I think this is a pretty obvious and interesting thing to think about. So genuine caring involves action, of course. So we already talked about how if you think Harry Frankfurt's view of caring is interesting, which I do, I think it's a good theory, then caring about somebody means desiring their well-being, right? So if you desire their well-being, you're going to be motivated to act to protect and promote their well-being, right? So there's always going to be some sort of action involved because caring is a motivational state. It motivates you to move, to act. And this is one way in which this theory is actually kind of superior to these other principle-based theories, because principle-based theories cannot adequately explain why it is that people are moral or why they should be moral. Why should people be moral? I mean, yeah, morality is it places demands on you, but you don't have to respond to those demands, do you? No, you really don't. But the fact that care ethics is interesting because it explains why we ought to be moral, and we ought to be moral because caring just is a motivational state, right? So we're motivated to act. And if you're motivated to act, then you've got to be motivated to conform your action to a certain sort of set of standards. And that's when we get to the final thing here. Caring is normative. Well, normative claims are claims about what we ought to do, right? And caring is normative. It's a normative domain, like law is a normative domain, or etiquette is a normative domain. Caring, just the act of caring, or the fact of caring, not the act of caring, but the fact of caring. If I care about my partner, then that puts constraints on my behavior. That caring dictates what I ought to do, right? So caring is normative in the sense that it places constraints on human behavior. And that's going to change depending on the kind of relationship. So those oughts are going to be relationship specific. Okay. That's really all I have to say. That's it. So this has not been, this is just basically a general overview of a kind of theory, in the same way that the other chapters have sort of just done a general overview of types of theories. We haven't gotten into the specifics of individual theories. But all that matters is that we're getting just a general overview of here's the landscape of morality. Here are these major sort of islands of thinking, each way of answering certain moral questions. And feminist ethics is going to be more along the lines of like on the virtue ethics side of things than on the principle-based side of things. Although you could take a sort of virtue ethics and sort of a consequentialist ethics and put them together and get yourself a nice feminist care ethics, which is what I like to do. But I mean, it doesn't map precisely. You have to kind of look at what kind of virtue you think is relevant. I mean, that's a problem with virtue ethics. It's like what are the virtues that we promote? And I think that what's relevant is that there is a certain way of being. I do think this. I think that there's a certain way of being that is going to put us closer to, shape our behavior in such a way that puts us closer to performing moral actions consistently. So that I like about virtue theory is that it just says, look, there is a particular way of being that is more conducive to being moral than other ways of being. Now, I don't know that we can necessarily identify specific virtues that do that, but I do think that we can identify certain cognitive and psychological traits that might do that. And so I've taken the virtue and I've put it into this sort of a cognitive psychological story. And then I've thrown in some consequentialism to explain the moral dynamic in a relationship. But yeah, so I think that this is an interesting way of thinking about things, and I think that it is much more conducive to social reform and moral reform. And I think that it's pretty clear that the United States needs that. I think that the last 4 years have shown us that we need that. So that's all the pontificating I get to do this semester. Thank you for hanging in here with me. It's been a pleasure being your teacher, even though I wish we'd had more time I wish we could have done this in person. I really prefer to teach in person. I'm not good at the online thing. I would much rather engage with people and hear what they have to say and, have a dynamic conversation. But what can you do? It's just me sitting here staring at a screen. So I wish you all the best. Take care.